a source of a pull. Remittance growth, because people who are abroad could send money back to their home countries, and remittances are very crucial, and that growth had disappeared. And when that disappears, the inequality in these countries becomes decisive, because if you have no growth, then what you have left is the inequality. The inequality is extremely great in the third world, as everybody knows. So I'm running out of time. So what would be a good outcome of the present crisis? In my opinion, a good outcome is that it lasts 10, 15 years. What would be a bad outcome? That it lasts 10 years and the unemployment rate keeps rising and poverty keeps increasing. One outcome is that there's a stalemate while the balance of powers perhaps shift back to labor. And the other is that there's a sharp collapse, as in the 1980s, where people like Thatcher and Reagan, and there are plenty of people waiting on the stage now to come in and to do the same thing. So politically, that is something that I fear. What can be done? There are issues about the composition of stimulus spending. Funds to the banks, which we know were completely sequestered because the bank's assets are totally fictitious, and so they keep the money. Funds to failing businesses, the same thing. They keep the money. Well, why would they want to spend the money when they have unsold automobiles piled up, hundreds of feet high? Then there's funds to businesses for infrastructure and social care, which was mentioned in the last panel, and these have the potential to have some impact, but they're quite modest right now. And what's missing is any discussion of the solution in the 1930s, which was, of course, direct employment. The work project type employment where the government comes in rather than throwing money at businesses, hoping some of it would land on labor. Second is the issue of consequences and limits to government spending. Now, it's clear that since the advent of fiat money, governments can create immediate funds for their expenditures. They don't need to tax first, they just write themselves a check. But it doesn't follow that they can do that without having to go back and cover that balance, at least not because they can't technically do it, but because they know what happened the last time governments were not allowed, were not restricted in their means of creating money. John Kenneth Galbraith in his book called Money notes that the American and French revolutions were financed entirely through the creation of money. And that led to the first major hyperinflations in human history. And as Galbraith Riley puts it at the end of the book, the revolution succeeded, but the currency failed. And that is the reason why we have the limits that we do on all of these expenditures. A very good reason, because you can see many parts of the world, like Argentina and Brazil, where they don't have those limits, and you get hyperinflation, because the government always needs money. So that leads to the second issue, which is not about the finance, but the effects of government deficits. And I have to, of course, as a person deeply concerned about theory, mention that there's no agreement, because there are at least 3 points of view, 3 broad points of view. One is the neoclassical one, that government deficits will crowd out private investment, so that in fact, they will not be stimulatory in the long run, because they will be pushing other things down. The second might be called the Keynes-Kalecki post-Keynesian position, which is that the stimulus is fine as long as you have unemployment. But when you reach employment, then it might be inflationary. And the third is a position I would call classical, which is that in fact, stimulus will have a positive short-term impact, but there are limits to that short-term impact, which come about depending on the effects on profitability. Profitability, this variable R that I've been talking about before, is a mixture of a normal profit rate corresponding to normal capacity utilization times the actual rate of capacity utilization. So capacity utilization rising raises profits. But if it lowers the normal profit rate because it raises wages relative to productivity, for instance, then it's not clear what its impact will be, and it's particularly not clear what its long-term impact will be. It's entirely possible to have no long-term impact or to have a negative long-term impact. So you create a kind of boom in the capacity utilization rising, and then you have the long-term profitability consequence, which is negative. And that's very common thinking in the classical tradition.
Professor Sheikh?
Yeah, I'm going to end right there. The third point is limits to government debt. We already see there's been much discussion about how governments can spend anything they want. Well, apparently no one told capital that. because you have to borrow from them, and Greece, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and maybe the UK are discovering what happens when capital markets don't want the government debt. And the third is what I want to end on, is the culpability of the economics profession. I sort of think of this whole episode in the 1980s to now as a period of kind of market worship. Many people have made that point, where the economists are the priests, and the incantation is perfect markets, perfect knowledge, perfect foresight, and I would add perfect nonsense. But it has dominated the profession. And as people, we stand there saying, yes, yes, we are imperfect. It's our fault, we are imperfect. It's time for us to stand up and say, no, the theory is fundamentally and soundly imperfect. A theory that doesn't understand the world cannot accuse the world of being imperfect. It must understand that it's imperfect. So one of the institutions we have to sweep away in this period is the orthodoxy of economics, and hopefully that will take place in a time long enough for us to be alive to see it. Thanks.
I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, Professor Eileen Grable. Professor Grable is a professor at Joseph Corbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. She has lectured at the Cambridge Advanced Program on Rethinking Development Economics since its founding. She is a research scholar at the Political Economy Research Institute at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Professor Grable has worked as a consultant to the UNDP, to UNCTAD, G24, WIDER, and with ActionAid and the NGO coalition New Rules for Global Finance. She has published widely on financial policy and crises, the political economy of international capital flows to the developing world, the relationship between financial liberalization and macroeconomic performance, central banking, exchange rate regimes, and remittances. She is the co-author, along with Ha-Joon Chang, of Reclaiming Development, an Alternative Policy Manual. She is now blogging, as are many participants at this conference, for the new Triple Crisis blog. Professor Grable will speak to us about the effect of the crisis on financial governance and policy space in developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you all. I want to especially extend my gratitude to the graduate students of the New School who've organized, I think, a really fabulous conference. I'm already needling my own graduate students about what you've all done. So thank you. I guess I should dedicate my remarks to Tom Pally. What I'd like to talk about is how bleak things have been for all of us on the left, and I think that in the context of things being so bleak for us for so long, it's quite understandable that all of us, I think, have fallen into a tendency of failing to recognize change when it begins to unfold, or at least when it begins to become possible. I think this is certainly something which is true for all of us who've railed for so long against the extension of neoliberalism across the developing world at the hands of the IMF, the World Bank, the economics profession, the US government, neoliberal reformers in the developing world. All of these agents have collectively been a very powerful juggernaut. And so I think in that context, we can forgive ourselves for failing to recognize and let alone take hope in any signs of change. And I think we could forgive ourselves for overlooking that if the stakes really weren't so high. But the stakes are very high, so I think we can't afford to be quite so self-forgiving. If our pessimism really leads us to discount far too readily evidence of aperture that I think could be exploited by progressives to bring about the kinds of changes in policies and ideas that the developing world so badly needs. I think at this juncture it's really important to guard against conclusions that I think are premature, that nothing has and nothing will change. In this spirit, what I argue is that what we are seeing right now is a chaotic response to the current global crisis by the IMF and even by national governments, and that this chaotic response to the global crisis represents a historical moment of what I call productive incoherence. And that productive incoherence, I think, has displaced the constraining neoliberal coherence of the past several decades. By this idea of productive incoherence, what I'm referring to is the proliferation of responses to the crisis by national governments and by multilateral institutions that to this point hasn't congealed into any sort of consistent strategy or regime. And so by invoking this concept of incoherence, what I hope to signal